Happy Tuesday or Wednesday, wherever you are in the world. I hope you all had a good week. Uh, so today between questions, I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of our newer models and boards that have been designed specifically for average small surf. But first, I'll answer a few questions. Uh, a good friend of mine, Joe, wanted to know how important the sand job is to the surfboard. That's a great question because I think sanders, yeah, sanders. Well, everybody that touches a surfboard along the line, from the shaper, obviously important, but the laminator, there's good laminators and there's inexperienced laminators. Same with hot coaters and sanders. The sanders are the ones that finish the board, and uh, they are, I don't want to say underappreciated, but the sanders are very, very important because what they're doing is they're taking a board that's been fine-tuned by the shaper, and it's been all the fine details in the shape have been subdued. During the glassing process, it's not intentional. It just happens because you're adding more material and you're losing the definition of the edges, the rail contours and such. But good sanders are hard to come by. It does take a long time for them to get it down. They have the job of removing as much of the hot coat as they can without challenging the structure, the strength of the board. Some guys just lightly brush over and just smooth. Other guys take off, weed. As early as my GNS days in the early '70s, every once in a while, I'd do a custom, or I'd do a board for myself, and I get the board and I go, man, this thing's a little heavy. Can you take another half pound off? And Bob Bocci, bless his heart, he said, yes, I'll take it down to as light as possible. And the other problem with that is if you go too far, if you take off too much hot coat resin, then you're compromising the strength of the board. The other key thing is the edges and the transition of the edges. I look at, to this day, I still look at a lot of different shapers boards and check the glass jobs, but a lot of times I don't see a really defined edge and where it starts in the last 18, 20 inches of the board. And that's every inch of the board's important, but that's the key zone. That's the control center back there. And I have, I mentioned this before, Josh Kerr, he used to go, I want my edge to start this far in front of the fence, 4 fingers. So, and other top surfers have mentioned, where they want the edge to start and how rapidly they want it to come into effect. And some people want the edge up a little bit further. Some of it want it tucked a little bit farther back. But that's a great question. The sander plays a very important role in the business of finishing a surfboard. How does the width of a surfboard affect performance? This is a good question. I've touched on this one before too, but if you have, say, 2 6.0s and one is 18 3/4 and the other is 19 1/4, and but they're identical in every other way. The volume isn't really going to change much. Less than a liter, probably close to like 0.6 of a liter. on a half-inch difference in width on a short board. Um, but the sensation you get when you ride the board is going to be very different. The narrower board, the closer the rails are to each other, whatever the width, the narrower the board, the quicker it's going to be from rail to rail, the more sensitive it's going to be. And then width, as you add width, it starts to add a little bit of stability and wave catching power. I've talked about how obsessed everyone is with volume these days, and actually surface area probably has more of an effect on the way the board rides than the volume. They're both important, but people don't really take into play the surface area, and I get customers obsessing on a half a liter of volume, but they don't say a word about the tail width. I mean, they could have a board with 15 3/4 inches wide tail, and I could design the same board with a 15.5 inch tail, and then a third version with a 15 1/4 inch wide tail, and they're going to ride significantly different, but the volume won't be much different. So yeah, as you go wider, the distance from rail to rail is greater, and that's reflects in how the sensitivity of the board. It becomes more stable, but it's less sensitive. Once again, it's the trade-off that the shaper ultimately has to make the decisions on. And I make boards, bigger boards, 23, occasionally 24 inches wide, and that's starting to get into, a 9-foot board, 24 inches wide and 3.5 inches thick. You're starting to get into SUP zone. But the width is, I'm shooting myself in the foot by, asking my customers to learn learn about the other key design components in a board, the width being one that's very critical. Rocker. I can, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, the different models, but I design all the models, and while the customer is obsessed on volume, I can change the rocker 1/4 inch, especially in the tail, and that will affect the way the board rides dramatically. Not dramatically, but it will definitely affect the way the board rides, much more than a half a liter. The width is, you might trust your shaper and explore your width a little bit more on your next board, especially if most of my customers are not advanced. I do boards for advanced surfers, but it's like a pyramid. I was a beginning surfer at one time, and the pyramid is the beginning surfers, the intermediate surfers, the intermediate advanced, and then the advanced, and then the pros. But the beginning and the intermediate surfers should really not get too influenced by all the different stuff they read on the internet. You should absorb it all and balance it out. But in the end, you should choose a shaper that you trust. How do you go about designing for very big guys? Start with a stock model, scale and tweak. Well, interesting you should ask that, because I'm a pretty big guy, and most shapers are average size, like 160, 70, 80, maybe 200 pounds, maybe a couple older guys, bigger guys, maybe a little bit more, but I was 6'4" most of my life. I'm starting to shrink a little bit, but in my fighting weight, I was about 215, 220, and gained a few pounds these days over the years, but so yeah, shaping boards for big guys came naturally to me, and I uh, for a while I had a hard time shaping boards for little guys, scaling them down that much, but uh, over time I got it, I think, and but bigger guys that you you really need to I think consider the width. Like I just did a couple of boards, an older team rider yesterday that weighs 215 now. He's a good surfer. He's a great surfer. He weighs 215, but he got a 6'1" that was 19 3/4 inches wide, and uh, I got the volume to where he wanted it. It was at the bottom end, but I was really concerned about the width because it was like 19 3/4 wide, and the the stability of the board and how it's going to board is about pressing in and getting resistance and then releasing and having the board spring out of a turn, and at some point you're going to overpower the board. And so uh, back to shaping boards for bigger guys, they I simply made them bigger, and I paid close attention to the proportions of the board, and I have a scale that works pretty good. It's as the board gets longer, in order to keep a similar curve, it's got to become about an 1/8 inch wider every inch it grows in length. It needs to be about an 1/8 of an inch wider, and then the nose and tail remain approximately the same. They grow a little bit as the board gets wider and longer, but the volume scale for bigger guys, you can not throw the volume scale out the window, but you have to expand it because the volume is a percentage of the surfer's weight, and 5% of 150 pounds versus 5% of 300 pounds is a big difference. But yeah, I have a lot of big surfers as customers. I've got the Big Cat was a board I designed for myself, as was the Moby Fish, the Yeti. It's a kind of a big guy, almost step up, kind of for better waves. Zeppelin Rick Hammond design, but it's a bigger, like a bigger guy hot dog board. It's got a little bit lower rocker and a little bit fuller tail, a little bit fuller nose. But we've got several boards that were built originally for big guys. How does the Blackbird compare to other similar types of step-ups and semi-guns? If you look back like 10 years ago, step-ups were 2 to 4 inches longer and a little bit narrower and more rocker, and they're pretty leaned out. And these days, about around roughly 10 years ago, Kelly started experimenting with the shorter step down, and we explored it and came up with a Slayer, and it worked good, but it had certain limitations, as all boards do. The boards, every board's going to ride differently, but the Slayer was good, and then it did its job. You could take off under the lip, pull in, and drive. But people were missing a little bit of curve in the back half, and the wide point was a little bit too far forward for people. So we did the Slayer 2, which balanced it out a little bit more. And then I did the Blackbird, which was, I call it a modern step up. And it's really, it's really grown into a step up, a semi-gun, and a gun. And the theory behind the Blackbird is a slightly, well, a balance, more of a balanced template, more of a balanced foil, and by balanced template, I'd say the nose is a little bit wider than most step ups, and uh, my entry rocker tends to be a little bit lower than I think a lot of other shapers because I don't think you need, especially in boards for bigger waves, because your lines are more drawn out. You definitely need plenty of rocker in the tail because that's the part of the board that's fitting the wave, and the front part of the board is, you know, it is. Um, the lower the rocker is up front, the easier it is to paddle and catch a wave. But the problem is when you drop in, if you have too low of an entry, it's going to purl or it's going to dig. So, but I feel like entry rocker's been. I've been playing with it a lot in the last couple of years, and I think I kind of bottomed out this last winter. But I do believe that, if you look at pictures of guys or watch videos, that front third of the board is not in the water very much. So I think that's the main difference in the Blackbird is maybe it's a touch fuller up front in the outline, maybe a touch fuller up front in volume, and a touch lower in nose rocker, but it's still got plenty of tail rocker. Hard rails, soft rails. I think next time I'm going to talk about the 419 fish. Why is it called the 419? Because I designed it on April 2019. But I've been making fishes. The first board I shaped in fall of '69 was basically a fish with a square tail. And my early boards were all twin fins from the Miranda brothers. But the 419 fish still has a lot of classic sensibilities, and it's got a full outline, a fairly full tail. It's got a little bit more curve in the outline than I think a lot of other fishes. And the entry rocker's lower, and the tail rocker's a little bit higher. And I tend to put, because of the width, I tend to put a little more lateral break into the board, whether it's a double barrel V or if it's just a straight V. And a lot of times I accelerate that from the center of the board through the hot zone or whatever you want to call it between your feet, and then it tails off slightly off the tail, but I still think you need a little bit of V off the tail to help finish your turns. And it's got a flattish deck. It's part, the 1984, the redo we did on that, the reissue a few years ago had a fairly flat deck, and then the blade, which we introduced a couple of years ago, Pedro. Blade we introduced about 2 or 3 years. I started playing around with it about 3 years ago, but we put it in the market about 2 years ago. The blade has a flat deck, a legitimate flat deck, and people were intrigued by the way it rode and how the flat deck boards. In order to keep the volume similar to a crown deck board, they need to be about 0.2 to 0.25 inches thinner, and that makes you closer to the water. The board gets more flex, and and the ride's different. It'll throw you off at first, but I think if you give it a session or two, you'll actually grow to like the flat deck. So the 419 was Yeah, a reissue of a pretty traditional fish, but a little bit more curve in the outline, a little flatter deck, and a little bit more tail rocker. And we've had good success on it. Uh, the blade, we have two designs. We have a concave version that it's got a fairly deep concave, about zero point 0.2 through the middle, about 2.5, 2.8 through the sweet spot, and it shallows out a little bit as it comes off the tail. The tails, I don't like concaves off the tail block. I just, my personal opinion is if you have a dead flat maybe, but a concave, the board doesn't complete the turn. It starts the turn, it holds really well, but then it gets to a point where it just doesn't want to transition as smoothly to the opposite rail as a light bit of release in the last 3 inches, or a slight convex V. Not, it doesn't need to be double. So the blade, we have a concave version, and then we have a 4-channel, which is 4 channels have gotten a lot of interest, not just from me, but from a lot of shapers in the last year or so. And these channels are roughly 30 inches long, give or take. 30, yeah, about 30, 24 to 30 inches long.
24, yeah.
Yeah. And I have the bottom laterally, it's flatter than the concave. It's very shallow in the center, like 0.05, and then it goes into a very, very light V through the sweet spot. And then there's the 4 channels, and I run it with a touch less tail rocker, and the thinking on that is to get a board that has a little bit more drive and distance out of turns, and it will be not as twitchy from rail to rail as a deep concave. But there's quite a few people that have been trying the four deep channels these days and getting pretty good feedback from them.
Who wants to know about what you're doing for Great Carmichael?
What do you say? His boards are like maybe like the SD, maybe as close. What would you say there is the closest board to the line?
Yeah, SD, because it's got the full concave,
pretty deep concave
rocker,
pretty full tail block.
Yeah, wide tail.
Well, yeah, wide tail. He rides a little bit more rocker than I typically put in boards. But he's fluctuating on sometimes he orders a board with a little bit less rocker, and then he wants to go back to a little bit more rocker. But he's been riding a board very similar to the SD, and will probably release his model in the next couple of months.
Yeah, it's coming. The keg.
The keg. It's called. Wade likes the cold one now and then. His model's going to be called the keg. What's the difference between the Dwart and the Dwart 2? Well, the Dwart, I've told that story a million times. It's a fish, basically, with a broken off tail that got turned into a double wing round tail. The Dwart 2 is a little bit leaner version of the Dwart, and it's got a full round swash, right?
Yeah.
It's got a tail with a bit more area, and it was fairly popular, and we still make it. But the Dwart's the champ. The Dwart and the Piranha's turned into the smoothie, and so the Dwart's I got pages and pages of clients that have gotten Dwarts and millions of files of Dwarts. So the Dwart's different enough to where the customer really feels the extra paddle, the glide, the float, but he can turn it. Anyone that's tried a traditional fish or a board that looks like a traditional fish, digs away at glides and catches waves and whatnot, but you really, it's really hard to put a traditional fish up on rail and finish your turn because the tail, the last 6 inches are so straight and so wide. And I've offered up other models like the Hatchet. The Hatchet is kind of a narrower fish, and it's a flat deck board. A flat. It's my dog. Where's the dog? Where's the dog? She wants attention. But anyways, the Hatchet is kind of a swallowtail version of the blade with a fairly deep concave, and it's got a fishtail about 7.5 inches wide. Traditional fish, minimum 10, maybe 11 or 12 inches from corner to corner. And as time has moved forward, I think a lot of shapers have pulled that in from 10 to maybe 9.5 or 9 inches. But the Hatchet is a very flat deck board, and then the Shiv is, the beauty. The beauty of a custom board is you can make anything flat. You can combine any of the elements, really. And I did a flat deck smoothie for a friend recently, and he's freaking on it. He goes, man, it paddles so good. I feel like I'm on top of the water, but I'm closer to the water, and so the Shiv is the SD. The basic components: the bottom rocker of an SD, the bottom laterally, the bottom of an SD, and the tail's pulled in slightly. But that's another part of our flat deck series. And I think if you've never tried a flat deck board, you should probably at least try one in your lifetime of your surfing career. What else we got?
People ask what the difference between the different tails, like squash, round pin, swallowtails, tail.
Yeah, I've touched on this before. Like, what differences all the tails make? I made a squash tail blackbird for a friend recently. Because he felt, and once upon a time all the shapers used to make step-up boards with a little bit narrower squash instead of a round tail or a round pin. And it's just about how it carries a little bit of extra area back in the last 6 inches. And I've mentioned Dave Barr before at his Shapeshifter project, where he's designed an interchangeable tail. He's got, at least 6, from swallowtail to dovetail, which is maybe it's old slang or something, but swallowtail is kind of a deeper cut, and it's a straight cut or got a slight curve to it. Dovetail is definitely a straight cut, but it's a shallower cut. And then there's a square tail, and then the squash tail, and then the round tail, and then the round pin. And as you go from swallowtail to round pin, the last 6 inches is where most of the difference takes place. And so his tail blocks, I'm not sure exactly how far up the board they go. Maybe to the back of the fin, probably the back of the fin. And so that's like 3 inches and change. But it definitely, it definitely has an influence in the way the board rides and turns, and how easy the board goes up on a rail versus how sharp of a direction change you can get, how square your turns can get, or how tight your release is. And generally, the wider tail boards with a straighter rail line in that last 6 inches, they have more areas, so they resist a little bit more. They plane a little bit better. And when you go to turn, they kind of fight back a little bit, but then they release and they come up the face, down the face. And as you start to, pull the square into a squash, you're starting to soften it up a little bit. And squash tails, arguably the most popular tail, but then you get a rounded squash, which is, a little bit of flat left in the back. And then the thumbtail, which is a blunt round tail. But the hopgoods used to love thumbtails. And then the round tail, and then the pintail. The pintail's got the least amount of area, and I don't know. I see the pintail as becoming a very, very specialty tail. I don't want to say it's a dying tail template, but it's certainly a lot less popular than it used to be because a square tail you can have vertical turns, a round tail you have smooth, angular turns. A round pin, when you drop down the face and you turn, it wants to draw the turn out, and it really doesn't want it. It will come up the face, and that's part of the rocker too, and the overall template curve. But the round pin, it's kind of Jerry Lopez. It's pull it and grin, pretty much. And there's guys that still want to surf like that, and that's cool. I'll probably say this every Tuesday, but if you have a question about design, take your question and take it to an extreme. Like, well, how's the squash tail going to ride differently than a round tail? Well, think about how a really square tail will ride versus a round pin. And then the shaper's job is to find that middle ground in there for how you want to surf. Same with thickness. Volume again. I still get guys obsessing on half a liter of volume. And you know what? There's about a 5% variance on when the boards come off the machine and after the shaper, whoever he is, shapes the board. Trust me, there's about a 5% variance there. And 5% is a lot more than half a liter.
Josh wants to know, how long did canyon boards existed?
That's a good question. How long did canyon boards exist? I started music surfboards when I came back from my trip in Australia in '74, and I had Bill Castor glass them for a while, and more or less he got too busy to glass them, and so I found another glass shop, Canyon. It was right between Pacific Beach and La Jolla in Rose Canyon, so that's a really creative name. But it was, God bless him, he's passed away, but John Durward was glassing boards for about 6 San Diego shapers, and he said, sure, bring your boards in, and over time, he had a shop in OB that carried a few Canyon surfboards that he had shaped, and then he asked me if I would shape some, trade them for glass jobs or whatever. I said sure, and then I got to a point where we're doing, the Canyon boards are starting to become popular, and he said, well, how about this? How about I glass all of your shapes, and you shape all of my board orders, and we'll call them all Canyons. And If it was now, I'd probably say, well, no, we'll call them musics. But so that's how Canyon got started. It was roughly 70, summer of 77, 78. I started doing Canyons, and his first his first his first team rider was Lane. It was not Wes, but his older brother, Randy Lane. And Randy was a pretty good surfer. But then as time went by, Wes's little brother, from Virginia Beach, and Wes actually made it on the tour. It was quite a good surfer. And then David Barr rode for us for a little while. And then PT, jumped in, and then PT introduced me to, a lot of good surfers that got, boards with Canyon stickers, or boards that they covered up the Canyon stickers. But Sean Thompson, we did a license with Sean for his boards for a couple of years, 79, 80, 81, I think. And the board started to grow in popularity, and I had some really talented up-and-coming Australian surfers. Richard Cram rode he rode them occasionally. And I think Robbie Bain started to get some, and then Mike Burness from South Africa, he was on the tour as well. So I started to have a handful of guys that either got the boards when they came into town, or actually started riding for us. And then the Aki thing happened in 83. Yeah, I remember that because he was 16. He was born in 66, right? Yeah, so anyways, I saw Aki. I was judging a contest in OB in 83, and it was a lot of the pro tours. It was kind of a California, like a U.S. contest, mainly California surfers, but this particular one, I think it was in June or May, and the tour was on its way to South Africa, and I saw Aki surfing, and I was the first time I'd seen him surf, first time I even heard of him, really, and he was 16, and I fucking tripped. I just go, this guy's really good. I could see how his board was hanging him up. So I made him a board to take to South Africa, and didn't connect. And then when he came back to surf the OP Pro, we connected, and he thanked me, and he said he probably wouldn't ride the board because he wasn't used to it, and he took it home and surfed in the most prestigious amateur contest in Australia, and won it on the board I shaped. And we took it to Japan and got into the semifinals with 4 or 5 inches of the nose broken off. And Bob Hurley called me, and he wanted to order a couple more and said he'd pay for them. And I said, yeah, sure, great. So those years, like 83, 84, 85, were the Canyon was blowing up. I was still buying my blanks at Mitch's, and John gave me a lot of work, but he stretched me out on the payment for the blanks and the shaping, because he got stretched out by the shops. But as soon as I went into business for myself, it didn't take long for that to happen. But so I'd say somewhere between 78, late 77, 78 for sure. So and then July 4th, 1985. I don't know, melodramatic July 4th freedom and whatever. I announced to John that I was going to go off on my own, and I'd honor all the orders we had. Back then, I pretty much shaped all by myself. Towards the end, I had to have a ghost shaper, Steve Bartow, a great underground guy in La Jolla, still shapes. But I was pretty much shaping them all by myself, so it took about 4 months. And PT, who's been a friend of mine since like 72, was marketing our ad director at Surfing Magazine, and he talked me into a little stamp size 1/6 of the page ad, and for rusty surfboards, and it came out. It came out about October, and I announced to John in July, and I was going, I don't know what I've done here, but within days, I started getting inundated for rusty orders, and I said, look, it'll take me 3 or 4 months before I can get to them, before I'm done with Canyon. And people said, I don't care. And I said, well, I'll need a half down deposit and payment in full on the board's end. They go, I don't care. And these days that's kind of unheard of. But so yeah, July 4th, 1985, and started, I can't remember exactly when, because it was a gradual transition from doing shaping blanks and giving them or training them to John with glass jobs, 77, I think. And I still, for summer 77, 78, and a little bit in 79, I still did a lot of outside shaping, especially for brands up in North County like Sunset Surfboards. I'm going to probably post a twin fin I made in, I think, 78 that I shaped for Sunset Surfboards. I'm going to probably post that in the next day or two. But yeah, that was, my first brand was Starlight, and I made about 200 of those with Elliott Raven in the early 70s, and then I got a job with G&S from 70, shaping from 72, 73, 74, music briefly, and then Canyon 70, let's call it 77 to 85, and then it's been the R-Dot brand ever since.
Darshan is already from Costa Rica. He
Yeah.
wants to know, what do you think is the best board to compete in Southern California? He comes all the time for competition here.
The SD is very, very popular. In terms of performance boards, I think it's about our most popular board. And once again, if you're a more advanced surfer and you want to tweak the rocker, that's not a problem. Changes are not a problem.
Yeah.
The typical 6-foot SD has maybe 4.5 to 4.6 inches of nose rocker, and I could do a Kelly Slater early 90s rocker and give it 5 3/4 inches of nose rocker. But I'd say the SD, because it's got a fairly deep single in it.
This guy, Rusty, what's weight riding? Everybody wants to know what's weight.
Yeah. No, Wade's riding a modified SD, and we'll have that board in the marketplace in the next couple of months.
The keg.
The keg.
Yeah.
What else?
What board evolved from the Redline model?
Well, that's a good question, because that goes back to the Blackbird.
Yeah.
The Redline, well, no, I take that back. The Redline was 15, 20 years ago. It was a performance shortboard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I take that back. It wasn't the Blackbird. But the Redline was kind of our go-to performance shortboard 15, maybe even 20 years ago. And then as Josh Kerr evolved, we started doing models named after him, like
Yes,
thanks. The Joker.
Crossover.
The crossover. Yeah, so we did a lot of the performance boards with tweaks of Josh's name.
Yeah.
Josh rode first for over 15 years. Is still to this day one of my favorite surfers. Josh, I'm probably not listening, but what else?
Joe Battaglia.
Joe Battaglia.
Do you think the Swallowtail is better option on small wave board? Water displacement drive for Swallowtail?
That's a good question. The swallowtail, as I said before, carries more area in the last 6 inches, and depending on the width, Generally speaking, don't see them much less than 6 inches from corner to corner. Occasionally, a little bit less. Um, but I think it comes down to personal, personal preference. I know Joe's had a few swallowtails lately that he's psyched on, but uh, you get a slightly different type of turn. I think you get a little bit more release out of a swallowtail. It holds, but then it releases more abruptly because you have a little bit less area between the fins. Overall, you probably have less area. You have more rail line. You have a straighter rail line and a little bit wider corner to corner. But overall, unless it's a very, very, very shallow dovetail, I think you have less tail area, but you have the width for the planing. But does that make sense? Yeah, you have the you have the wider tail block the last 3 to 6 inches, and so the board swallowtail I think pivots a little bit more abruptly than the squash tail in the way it turns. Once again, it goes back into, well, how about a swallowtail versus a round tail? And round tails are insane for rail-to-rail fluidity. Swallowtails are a little bit more dynamic.
There's one question that a guy actually asked me today. What's the difference between a single concave running through the bottom and a double concave into a V? I mean, slide V.
I think
Functionality.
the functionality. I think for small wave boards, deep signals are fine. You can as the board as you start to demand more out of the board in terms of size, the waves you're going to ride. I think my personal opinion, but I think the concave in the center starts to shallow out, and in the sweet spot it starts to shallow out a little bit, and then I do it on some of the small wave boards. I do a single to a double. I think the break in the bottom helps initiate turns, and it helps set the rail more. Whereas if you imagine you had a board with a half an inch deep concave, it would be very twitchy, it'd be very alive, it'd probably be pretty fast, but it'd probably be pretty tough to control or hold on a rail or get any bit of real distance out of the turn. And as you get in the boards, you get in a step up like a blackbird that's a couple of inches longer, I start to shallow out the concave and I start to split it. And as you get into longer and longer boards, the guns I make don't have any concave in them. I mean, once you start to get up around 8 foot, there might still be, a flat through the middle and a slight double concave. But as you get in the boards for bigger and bigger surf, it's not about collecting energy. The concave sort of, keeps the water under the board and gives you a lot of lift, whereas the V-bottom displaces the water. And when you have a wave with a lot of power, you don't want to be generating, at least now, maybe 5-10 years, someone will figure it out. But when you get into bigger surf, I mean, when you have surface conditions, concaves don't like bump. I build boards for friends up at the ranch, and they have pretty perfect waves, but they have wind a lot of times. So I tend to make their concaves very shallow, and I do some almost full-length V's for them. So surface conditions affect, what kind of bottom I'm going to put on the board, and the wave size. And when I'm doing 9/6 guns, I have maybe 0.08 to 0.01 break in the nose area, and as it comes into the middle, it still has a very light break, and then as you go back towards the back third, um, I'll get 0.18 to 0.22 in a lateral break, and it's pretty much a flat panel V. So I hope that explains basically the difference in the ride and what the boards are designed for. It's like the blade, the channel bottom versus the concave bottom. The concave bottom is going to feel a lot flightier. It will feel probably looser, whereas the channel bottom is going to have more drive and more direction.
So I want to know, is Wade Modify ST model still a single deep concave? Sister brother and SD comparison. GTR old model. Comments. Comes to mind.
We got so many models that start to run together. But the way Wade's his model will have a slightly deeper concave than the SD. It'll have more rocker on both ends, and slightly fuller rail, but
High apex.
a higher apex. Yeah. On a lot of my models, I tend to shape maybe a touch lower apex than a lot of shapers do, but Wade's got a little bit higher apex, and we're talking. If you put a T-square, on the bottom of a board and you have it go up the rail, the rails are on average in the midpoint are tucked under 0.6, give or take, maybe 0.65, 0.68, 7 at the most, and then they're about the same distance up. I can't think of a rail that I do that's less than 0.55, and I'm in the low sixes a lot of the time. And when a board gets a higher apex, or it gets bigger, it naturally gets a higher apex because instead of 2¼ inches, it's 3¼ inches, so it goes up proportionally to the mid sevens. But his apex is probably close to 0.7, I think, maybe even a touch more.
Yeah, it's the frisbee rail.
Yeah, frisbee rail. What
And
else?
use the sister brother and SD comparison.
Sister Brother was kind of ahead of its time. It's a pretty deep,
The sister.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a Josh Model 2, right?
No,
Noah Dean. Yeah, Noah Dean. Yeah, Noah Dean, and it has a fairly deep concave, but I think the SD has our, not by much, but it has our deepest single.
Yeah, now I think it is.
Yeah.
You brought up the GTR. That's a new one.
The GTR. The names, the names are sometimes complete nonsense, but the GTR was a board back in the day. I don't know if, once again, like 15 plus years ago. It was a hot dog board. It was a small wave board. It had a balance point pretty far back. It was a little bit narrower nose, and it had a wider tail block, and was a little bit lower tail rocker. And I'm trying to think of what you could replace it with these days. Maybe, I don't know, maybe a Dwart 2, but the Dwart 2 has a little bit fuller nose, but kind of along the lines of the Dwart 2, but with a narrower nose and a little bit more rocker. But I haven't made a GTR. We've got boards in the archive that I haven't made in, I don't know, 5 or 10 years. Somebody asked me the other day about a burnout model. A burnout model. And I honestly couldn't remember what it was. It was actually a board that Rick Hammond was fooling around. Rick and Zach up in my shop in Del Mar are always coming up with new models. Some of them make it into the line, some don't. But I think that was a model that Rick was working on, but I don't think it made it into the line.
Well,
we're about out of time.
about
So
4 times before we got cut off. So if you want to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I think that covers it. I'm trying to address different questions and topics each week, but sometimes we get drawn back into things, and I don't know whether I should apologize or what. We get drawn back into things like volume and things that it's interesting because a lot of questions are about volume, and rightfully so, because it's been the buzz the last few years, because all the different shapers, even if they don't have a machine, have access to a volume calculator, and so volume has become the buzz. But I'll finish up by saying you should learn a little bit more about different aspects of design, like a question rocker, and once again, I'm shooting myself in the foot, but question the rocker, question the balance of the template, and how wide the nose and the tail are, and the thickness balance and things like that. But anyways, I'm obsessing on volume again. Guys, have a great week, and hope to chat with you all next week. All right, take care.